I don't have
Okay.
sounds.
We are now live. No problem. So I am hello, I am Gabby Goldstein. I am our political director at the Sister District Project and director of research at the Sister District Action Network. And I'm so excited to be here with Ari Berman, who is the author of our book club selection for this quarter, which is the fantastic Give Us the Ballot. Here it is. In its very dog-eared form on my desk. Ari, thank you so much for being here with us.
Hey, Gabby. Thanks for being here. Sorry I couldn't see you in person, but next best thing, I imagine.
It's true. Through the wonders of technology, we are here together to discuss the magical, incredible world of voting rights. What can I say? And what a day for it, too. I know you've been... I follow you on Twitter, so I know we're all up, watching what's going on with judicial confirmations and all the rest. But I thought I might just give a brief overview of Sister District, what we're all about, and then go over a few things that I'm hoping that we can talk about on this call, and then we'll just take it from there, and we will be sure to be off in less than an hour. So the Sister District Project was started after the 2016 election by myself and 4 other co-founders, really with the idea of focusing exclusively on state legislatures as overlooked venues of power for Democrats. And at RC4, where I'm director of research, it's a nonpartisan organization where we work on voter registration, civic engagement, and where our book club is housed. So in this conversation, I am wearing my C4 hat, but those are the two sides of the Sister District coin. We've grown to about 40,000 volunteers across the country, organized into local teams. We have about 75 active teams, and that is the general organization. So as I mentioned, one of the things that we do at Sister District Action Network is our book club. And so this quarter, we have read Ari's book about the Voting Rights Act, Give Us the Ballot. So just wanted to give a quick overview of the questions or the topics that I thought we might talk about. So first is just the Voting Rights Act, of course, which is front and center in the story, and really thinking through the factors that led to its ability to be passed and the ways in which it's been so transformative and transformational. The effects of the VRA and its main mechanisms, Section 5 in particular, which was the main enforcement tool until the Shelby decision. And then some shifts in how the Voting Rights Act has been interpreted over time, shifts in enforcement by DOJ from administration to administration, shifts in the narrative that has been used, particularly around this idea of the law being colorblind or colorblindness in the law, shifts in congressional support and the consensus, and then shifts in GOP tactics. Particularly around the use of voter fraud as a mechanism to shield the GOP politically from scrutiny while passing all kinds of restrictions. And then hopefully we could spend a couple minutes talking about how we got here, particularly I'm really interested in your thoughts on the unholy alliance and the long-term negative effects that it's had for Democrats, particularly in the South, and the idea of majority-minority districts and where we go from there. And then thinking in a future sense, where do we go from here in terms of voting rights? Section 5 is dead, but what about Section 2? Is there a court strategy that activists should employ? State-based strategies as an organization that's really focused on the states. It seems like there are electoral strategies, particularly at state legislatures and secretaries of state, but also ballot initiatives. There's always the question of Congress. Would it be possible? I know Pelosi has indicated that the House would move on some new legislation, and then redistricting. 2021 would be the first new set of maps after Shelby. Does that matter? What do we do? So that's an overview of all the things that I'd love to talk about in the next 48 minutes. How does that sound? Ambitious.
I was going to say, it sounds like a lot to cover in an hour.
It is. We'll see how far we get. But just starting with the Voting Rights Act, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the impetus for it. Certainly, I think that you bring out really clearly in the book that LBJ was a sort of a surprise that he was interested in civil rights, and how we got to the Voting Rights Act.
Well, you have to go back and think about what the situation was like, particularly for Black Americans in the segregated South. You had a situation in places like Selma, Alabama. Only 2% of African Americans were registered to vote. In the county next to Selma, there wasn't a single Black voter, even though the county was 80% African American. In states like Mississippi, only 6.7% of African Americans were registered to vote in the entire state. So you had entire sections of the country where basically an entire race of people was disenfranchised. And that lasted for a long time. I mean, that lasted for decades. And the question was, how do you change the situation? And the civil rights movement got more active, and there was the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. There were the sit-ins in 1960. There were the Freedom Rides in 1961. There was the March on Washington in 1963. There was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, all of which created momentum for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but everyone knew the Voting Rights Act was the big piece of legislation that they needed to pass to enshrine the civil rights revolution. That was the only way you're going to shift the power dynamics and actually give full rights to people who had been disenfranchised. And so really what's interesting is after the Civil Rights Act is passed in 1964, Martin Luther King goes to meet LBJ in the White House. And Martin Luther King has just won the Nobel Peace Prize for his civil rights activism. And he tells LBJ, I'm going to Selma, Alabama in January 1965 to lead a campaign to pass the Voting Rights Act. And LBJ basically tells King, I support this, but it's not going to happen now. I just signed the Civil Rights Act. I want to do Medicare and all the Great Society stuff, not to mention all the stuff he had going on with Vietnam. And, this is just going to have to wait. And Martin Luther King was like, I'm going anyway. We'll see what happens. And so beginning in January of 1965, there are these sustained demonstrations to try to pass the Voting Rights Act. But really the key moment is Bloody Sunday on March 7th, 1965, where 800 people led by John Lewis, now, of course, a very well-known congressman from Georgia, they marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, named after a former Confederate general. And they're trying to march from Selma, which is really the epicenter of voter suppression, to Montgomery, the state capital, to protest the disenfranchisement of Black voters. And so they get across the bridge. They are brutally beaten by Alabama state troopers. They are tear gassed. They are whipped on horses. They are beaten with billy clubs. ABC cuts into its primetime premiere of Judgment at Nuremberg, a film about Nazi Germany, to show the footage of Selma. And a lot of confused viewers think that they are actually seeing footage of Nazi Germany, but it's actually Selma, Alabama, right here in the United States. And that creates a groundswell. That protest, those atrocities, the entire country sees it. And LBJ realizes he can't wait anymore. And so 8 days after Bloody Sunday, he introduces the Voting Rights Act of 1965 before a joint session of Congress. It passes in August of 1965. And I think the disenfranchisement of Black Americans, the violence that was faced by them, the situation in the segregated South, it was completely untenable. And even though LBJ was someone that had voted against every civil rights bill for the 20 years he was in Congress initially, once he became president, he knew he had to do something about this problem or it was going to tear the country apart. Yeah, absolutely. And so the effects of the civil rights of the Voting Rights Act were clear. The numbers are astronomical in terms of the voter registration that shot up all around the South, particularly
for African Americans, and all the rest. And really, in looking at the law, and I'm a lawyer, but I'm not a constitutional scholar, so it's but it seems like Section 5 really was the main enforcement mechanism as it was designed, and Section 4 provided the formula for certain jurisdictions to need to submit voting changes to the federal government. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about a little bit more about the mechanics of how the law was meant to work, at least until 2013.
So basically, the first thing that the Voting Rights Act did was it struck down the literacy tests and other suppressive devices that had prevented people from registering to vote in the segregated South. So before the Voting Rights Act, if you wanted to register in a place like Selma, Alabama, and you're African American, you had to name all 67 county judges to get on the voting rolls. I mean, absurd things like that obviously nobody could pass, and most white people were never asked those kind of questions. So those kind of things were struck down by the Voting Rights Act. So that was the first thing that happened. That literally happened overnight. Then right after the Voting Rights Act was passed, federal officials actually went to the South to register Black voters in places like Selma. So you had a situation where nobody was registered for decades, almost a century, in places like Selma. Suddenly hundreds were being registered in a day, thousands in weeks. This was really revolutionary to have the federal government show up and say, we're not disenfranchising people any longer. And then you began to see a shift in terms of who could run for office, who was elected, when African Americans started voting in large numbers. But what LBJ and the Congress realized was that once you struck down a literacy test or a poll tax in Alabama, they were just going to try to pass a new one, because that's what they had done for decades. And so what the Voting Rights Act did is it said to those states with the longest histories of discrimination, they actually had to approve their voting changes with the federal government so that they couldn't discriminate in the future. But the federal government could actually stop discrimination in voting before it ever occurred. And that's what made the Voting Rights Act such a powerful piece of legislation. You often hear about how laws pass and then people don't comply with them. Well, that wasn't an option here. This was the toughest possible enforcement mechanism, because they knew this was the only way to get states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia to comply. If you didn't have that enforcement mechanism, they were just going to find a new and more innovative way to discriminate.
Totally. And then over time, the sort of purpose or the meaning of the VRA changed, right? So I think that you discuss sort of the generations of changes in law and discriminatory policies that were meant that the VRA sort of was meant over time to accommodate or to avoid. And so sort of in the first generation, it was this sort of narrow ability to register to vote and access to the ballot. And then it shifted over time to potentially having a broader interpretation, requiring access to representation, but then even later access to proportional power. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that shift. And certainly there's a partisan bent to what the VRA means and what sort of interpretation it might require. But that shift seems to be really instrumental in how the VRA has evolved over time.
Yeah, so the first question that the Voting Rights Act was concerned with were people just going to be able to register to vote? I mean, literally, it was that simple. Like, you had a situation where thousands and thousands of African Americans couldn't even register to vote. So the first thing was allow them to register to vote. Okay, well, then they got registered. Then the question is, what are they going to vote for? Is there going to actually be a shift in the power dynamics? Because it wasn't just about letting people register, it was about shifting political power. And so then the question is, are you going to be able to elect city council members, county commissioners, mayors, members of Congress, governors, who reflect those communities? And that was a huge fight. And that was a fight in the late 60s and the 70s and the 80s, all the way up to the 90s, to allow people to actually be elected, because it wasn't that easy. There were discriminatory election system, there were discriminatory voting laws, there were a lot of things that needed to be dismantled. The whole architecture of white supremacy in the South had to be dismantled. It took a long time to get the first Black city council members and the first Black county commissioners and the first Black mayors in places like Selma. It took decades. So that was the next fight. And then the question was, okay, you've elected one black city council member, but the town might be 60% African American. So you're not actually you're having a token representation, not representation that's reflective of the community. So then how can you increase representation so that people that can actually control their communities, so that you don't have one African American member of the city council and 4 white members that are always going to vote against them? Because voting, it still is like this, but especially back then, was very racially polarized. So even more than party, because there were a lot of segregationist white Democrats still, race was even more of a factor. And you had, in some cases, you had interracial coalitions, and that was a big innovation of the Voting Rights Act. In other places, you didn't. In other places, you had white voters that just wouldn't vote for a black candidate, and white officials that just wouldn't work with black office holders. So then the next fight was, okay, shifting from representation to equity, which is how are we going to have representative political power? And that took even longer. I mean, so one of the things that I think people forget or don't realize about the Voting Rights Act is they think, oh, this great law was passed in 1965, it struck down all this voter suppression, and we kind of solved that problem. What I tried to tell in my book in a sequential way was that once you settled one fight, a whole new battle started. And those battles lasted decades.
Absolutely. And that narrative and that arc seems perfectly clear from our perspective, but certainly there is the movement conservatism and certainly in the judiciary an alternative interpretation of the purpose of the law. And certainly as the Supreme Court has shifted right, it's taken a more narrow view. And so it sort of comes down to this question. I mean, it was the law was reauthorized not a decade before the Shelby decision, and didn't Congress make it clear what it meant then in 2006? But apparently not. So they're really the shift, the narrative around moving from access to vote to representation and power makes sense from a certain perspective, but there's this countervailing conservative position.
Well, there was, and I mean, that evolved over time too. I mean, initially, conservatives challenged the Voting Rights Act. States, basically the governors of the South, the George Wallaces of the country, challenged the Voting Rights Act on pretty straightforward states' rights grounds. They basically said the federal government couldn't tell states how to set their voting qualifications. And this very quickly went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in 1966, in the 8-1 ruling, said the Voting Rights Act was essentially meant to enforce the 15th Amendment of 1870, which said that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And that was basically ignored for almost 100 years. And all the Voting Rights Act was doing was enforcing the 15th Amendment, which should have been enforced from the very beginning. And so once the law was constitutional, you think that would have settled the debate. But then more sophisticated arguments were made against the Voting Rights Act. And really what happened was when you began to see a shift in representation, the first black officials, the first Latino officials, the first Asian American officials. Because remember, the Voting Rights Act didn't just affect African Americans. In 1975, it was expanded to encompass language minorities. So that encompassed Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, other Pacific Islanders. It was a big, broad expansion. So suddenly Texas and Arizona and all of these other places, parts of California, parts of New York are covered as well. And when you actually saw a shift in representation, then you begin to see a new argument made against the Voting Rights Act. And you talked about this a little bit in your questions. But then people started making the argument that the Voting Rights Act had led to affirmative action in the electoral sphere, and that it was prioritizing some voters over another. And that while it may have been well-intentioned, it was being used to discriminatory ends. That essentially now white people were being discriminated against. And I think this was an absolutely absurd argument, because you were talking about electing the first African Americans, the first Latinos, the first Asian Americans. We weren't anywhere close to proportional representation. As one civil rights lawyer told me, we were trying to get from none to some. So they did this was affirmative action of proportional representation was completely idiotic, given that whites remained in control of everything. But that argument was very effective, because then people could talk about this idea of color blindness, which you mentioned earlier. And they could say, well, we don't oppose civil rights. We want everyone to be equal. Isn't that what Dr. King said in his I Have a Dream speech? And so that was a more sophisticated argument than the argument George Wallace made. And that was tougher to counteract. And I think once you saw the kind of rampant discrimination go away, the poll taxes go away, it was harder to explain to people why the Voting Rights Act was so necessary, even though, as you mentioned, the Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act 4 different times. And each time they reauthorized it, there was overwhelming support in the Congress, and the reauthorizations were actually all signed by Republican presidents. So the law had very strong bipartisan support despite the opposition to it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I mean, the idea of colorblindness and the narrative about it, starting off as an organizing principle of the 50s and 60s civil rights movement, but then being co-opted, I think, by Nixon for conservatism to oppose the consideration of race in any policy. Certainly that part is clear. What's a little less clear is that it seems during, and certainly we've come back to that in the Roberts Court, but there seemed to have been an interstitial period, if I'm understanding it correctly, during the Unholy Alliance period in Bush 1, when the GOP strategy or the conservative strategy flipped towards absolutely using race as a consideration in the drawing of in the drawing of majority minority districts.
Yeah.
And there was this like 180 during the Bush 1 years, and then it flipped back again. But we're left with this legacy of majority minority districts, which in fact perhaps disadvantaged Democrats in the long run.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting discussion, and it's probably the most nuanced part of my book, because if you think about who was advantaged in the years before the Voting Rights Act, it was white Democrats, and who was disenfranchised were African Americans and white Republicans, because the South was a one-party region. And so, by the 80s, by the 90s, white Democrats are still in control of a lot of places, and Black Democrats are saying, where are we in this? Why don't we have seats in Congress? Why don't we have a seat at the table? And white Republicans are saying the same thing. How come Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan carried our states, but Democrats have a majority in all of these congressional districts? And so in some states, not all states, in some states, there was an alliance between white Republicans and Black Democrats to create what are called more majority minority districts that would elect both more African Americans and also more white Republicans, because what you would do is you would take districts and you'd put more minorities in them, so that would give Black Democrats seats, but then the white Democrats would be put in more conservative districts, and then those would eventually elect Republicans. Now, I think that this has been kind of overstated in the sense that the South was trending Republican already. And so if you looked at the presidential level, Republicans were already winning a lot of these states. So it was only a matter of time before Republicans took over state government in places. And I think in some cases, Black Democrats became scapegoats for this. On the other hand, you had no minority representation. So I'm not really sure what they were supposed to do. It wasn't like suddenly the white Democrats in Georgia or in Mississippi or Alabama were just going to give up power and say, oh, you know what, we should have someone else in there. And so it was this weird thing. And what's happened more recently, in fact, is that a lot of Black Democrats have become uncomfortable with this strategy, because what white Republicans done is they've taken districts that are already electing Black Democrats, that are already majority minority districts, and they've increased the number of minority voters more and more and more. So you go from a 50% African American district to an 80% African American district. And no one wants that, because then you are essentially concentrating all of the Democrats in a state into one or two places. And so I feel like the Unholy Alliance doesn't exist anymore. I think it existed for a brief period of time when there was a real need for increased representation. I think now it's become a cynical strategy by Republicans to kind of turn the Voting Rights Act on its head.
Totally. And I mean, even later Republican administrations attacked their own creation as racial gerrymanders, right? The Shaw decision is a case there, right? So, I mean, it seems like that the Republicans got the better end of that bargain, both in terms of the fact that the white Democrats were cracked cracked among more conservative leaning districts, and so lost their seats. A lot of white Democrats incumbents lost their seats, but also that further Republican administrations ended up attacking these very districts that they had helped create in the in the Project Ratfuck or whatever Ginsburg, Ginsburg had called it, as racial gerrymanders. But it is a really kind of interesting thing. I'm curious, does the Trump administration have a position on color blindness as a strategy, or the interpretation of the VRA? I'm not clear. I just haven't been following what the DOJ, this current DOJ's position is on majority minority districts and this idea of color blindness in policy.
Well, I don't think this administration has a position on the Voting Rights Act. I mean, they haven't done anything to enforce it. They just have not enforced it. I mean, and so I don't think you could even say there is a strategy. If there's a strategy at all, it's just to ignore it and neglect it and let it wither on the vine, because they haven't filed any lawsuits to try to enforce the Voting Rights Act. They haven't joined any redistricting cases. The only thing they've done is support restrictive voting measures that are at odds with the Voting Rights Act. So we haven't really seen anything from the Trump administration one way or the other. I mean, if they did have a strategy, I think it would be a strategy, number one, to try to protect the Republican Party. And I think, number two, to try to disenfranchise or disadvantage minority voters. But the Justice Department isn't even operating on that level. I mean, like, there are other administrations, like the Nixon administrations and the Reagan administrations and the Bush II administrations, where there were huge fights over voting rights and something of a push and pull. And I think with Trump, it's just like there's not even a push and pull anymore, because everyone realizes it's so terrible, and the Congress has been so terrible, and the Supreme Court's been so terrible, that there hasn't been anywhere to pull, essentially. So it's just been, they're just going to essentially ignore the Voting Rights Act, and it's going to be up to private groups, essentially the ACLU, the Lawyers Committee, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, to pick up the slack. And that's really unique, because usually there was at least one branch of the government, whether it was the executive branch, the legislative branch, the courts, that were reacting to voter suppression. Now that's not happening at all. And that's a really new and unique development. Even in the Bush years, Democrats had control of Congress for a lot of that time.
Yeah, no, and certainly, and there's also a place for citizens through ballot initiative, and certainly so much of voting rights are coming back to the states as state issues, and so there's it seems strategically, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Certainly, a place we can go from here is to focus on the states and focus on electoral and ballot initiatives. Strategies for that. But one other thing I wanted to talk about is the focus on voter fraud. And again, I'm curious if the Trump administration, I'm just so out of the loop. I do have, I have some friends who are still at the DOJ as staff attorneys in this administration, but I just, I haven't been following what this administration has been doing at the DOJ at all. But certainly in prior Republican administrations, federally, and certainly in the states that are controlled by Republicans, there's just been a massive strategy, at least since Bush II, to use the idea of voter fraud as a mechanism to pass restrictive laws. And with the Crawford decision, Supreme Court decision, states don't even need to show that there is any evidence of fraud. Just, the idea of the possibility of fraud is enough of a compelling, legitimate purpose, or whatever the standard is. And so I'd be curious to hear more from your perspective about the use of the idea of voter fraud as a shield, and then what's been happening since, especially 2010, post 2010, the just piling on of restrictions in terms of voting access and voting rights in the states.
Well, it's interesting. If you go back and you look at the rhetoric that George Wallace and governors like that used against the Voting Rights Act, a lot of it was very similar to the stuff that Donald Trump is saying, which is George Wallace was saying you're going to have this massive corruption of the electoral process if you allow African Americans to vote. That the vote would be corrupted and diluted by illiterates and ignorance and all of this stuff. And so the argument about voter fraud is not a new argument. I mean, it was made during Reconstruction by white segregationists. It was made in the 1960s by segregationist governors, and it's been weaponized now by Republicans to build support for an agenda that will make it harder to vote. Because if you're going to make it more inconvenient for people to vote, or you're going to put new restrictions on voting, you need some sort of rationale for it. And the rationale for it was that somehow there's, massive widespread voter fraud, that then we have to pass voter ID laws and make it harder to register to vote and do all these other things that we've seen in recent years. And so we saw that strategy really kick into high gear in the second Bush administration. That's when you had U.S. attorneys who were actually fired, Republican U.S. attorneys who were fired because they wouldn't prosecute voter fraud cases because there was no evidence of voter fraud. I mean, these were attorneys who absolutely would have prosecuted voter fraud if they had evidence of it, but they didn't have evidence of it. And then you really saw a massive escalation of the strategy after the 2010 election, when so many states flipped from blue to red, and you suddenly had all these Republicans in control of all of these key swing states, and you had Barack Obama in the White House. And basically their strategy to try to counteract the first black president was to pass all of these voter suppression laws in the states. And the way they built support for all of these voter suppression laws was by invoking the specter of rampant voter fraud, particularly in reaction to the first black president. So there was a major racialized component about it. All the stuff about Acorn was very heavily racialized. And so that really lays the groundwork for what you're seeing today. And then, of course, Donald Trump has just dramatically escalated it even further by first claiming that 3 million people voted illegally in the election he won. And then just in the last election, casting doubt on recounts and the counting of ballots and mail-in ballots. I mean, basically casting the regular mechanisms of voting. Recounts, counting ballots by mail, counting provisional ballots, all of these things that are a natural part of the election. Trump has somehow made to be somehow illegitimate. And I think they're laying the groundwork for 2020, where they want to put new restrictions on voting, so they're ratcheting up the rhetoric, but they also want to have some sort of escape route if they end up losing the election to try to challenge the legitimacy of it. So I think what we saw in 2018 was really a test run for what we're going to see in 2020.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the ratchet up of these strategies around voting restrictions in the states coincided with the extremely effective red map strategy to take over state legislatures, and also the extremely effective infrastructure in ALEC, which has been such a driving force in policy transfer, conservative policy transfer. And I mean, it raises, in my mind, an important question, which is that there kind of is this broader conservative infrastructure for pursuing these policies, and what is the countervailing force on the Democratic side, or in the camp of voting rights and pro democracy alliance? We don't have an ALEC. We don't really. I mean, we have a sister district. We don't have a red map, a blue map. I mean, but it is sort of an interesting and really important challenge as we think about 2020. To what extent did this broader conservative infrastructure lead to the success that we've seen in rolling back voting restrictions? And does the Democratic Party have any blame here for a lack of a broader strategy on the other side?
Well, I think Democrats picked a very bad election to lose in 2010 because they lost the election that would then determine the drawing of districts. So, I mean, if they had lost in 2012, they might have lost an election and got power back right away. So they lost an election, they were basically out of power for almost a decade until 2018. A lot of places, and some places they're going to be out of power until 2020 or beyond. And essentially, pretty much every state that did really bad gerrymandering also passed one or more voter suppression laws. I mean, so it absolutely worked hand in hand, which is you make it harder for people to vote, and then you also draw districts to enshrine your own power, whether it's Wisconsin or North Carolina or Pennsylvania or Ohio. I mean, all of these things, I mean, the redistricting maps, the gerrymandering, and voter ID laws, cuts to early voting, restrictions of voter registration, I mean, it all happened around the same time. So it was, if not the first thing they did, the second or third things they did in all of these states. And that's really how, and of course, you had conservative organizations like ALEC giving giving them the bills to do the voter ID laws. You had them helping to support the redistricting efforts. You had a lot of corporate money backing this up. And so it was absolutely part of a coordinated strategy to try to keep power for the next decade. Democrats were really caught very flat-footed. When I started covering voting rights in 2011, the Democratic Party was doing almost nothing. I don't think there is a progressive ALEC, but I think there's a lot of new groups like your group, like Indivisible, like Swing Left that have popped up. And I think that altogether, they are forming a counterbalance. And I think 2018 was the first time you really saw progressive Democrats in a sustained, sophisticated, strategic way focus on the states, like the Republicans have said, and said, if Donald Trump is going to control the presidency, we're going to control as many states as possible. And even if we don't control those states, we're going to put initiatives on the ballot that are going to expand voting access. Because number one, that'll be good for democracy. But number two, that'll help shift the power dynamics in a lot of these places. And so the fact that there were initiatives on the ballot in 7 states in 2018 to expand voting rights, the fact that they passed in every single state is a remarkable victory for democracy. And it really shows that there's broad support for a pro-democracy agenda. And you can go pretty much anywhere and make a case against gerrymandering, and go pretty much anywhere and make the case for early voting or automatic voter registration. And some things are going to remain controversial. Voter ID laws are going to remain controversial. But you take everything else, there is very strong support for automatic registration, for election day registration, for early voting, for restoring voting rights to ex-offenders, for nonpartisan redistricting. I mean, I just named 5 things that can form the backbone of a pro-democracy agenda. And they passed in Utah, they passed in Missouri, they passed in Florida. So they're not just passing in Oregon or California. And so I actually think Republicans are on the defensive on a lot of this stuff, that they are losing the battle on voting rights. Now, they're winning it because they're able to keep power in a lot of these states, but they're losing the war of ideas here. And all they're left is with this bogus rhetoric about voter fraud and these ridiculous claims about illegitimate elections. Meanwhile, more and more of the country is working to expand voting rights. We went to 1 state having automatic registration in 2016 to 14 states having them now. 37 states have early voting. 27 states have no excuse absentee ballots. So, I mean, that's the good thing. The thing that I worry about, and I wrote about this after the election for Mother Jones, is what do you do about the places that don't have ballot initiatives, or that don't have Democratic majorities, or that don't have reasonable Republicans? What do you do about Georgia and Texas and those kind of places? And I worry that we are heading back into a pre-Voting Rights Act era, where it's easy to vote in some places, quite easy to vote in California right now. It's a lot harder to vote in Georgia. And I think that's a problem, because that was the exact situation the Voting Rights Act was trying to get rid of, where you had a lot of Black elected officials in New York, but you had none in Alabama. And that was the exact divide that LBJ wanted to get rid of when he signed the Voting Rights Act. And I think we're heading back to that place. And we are normalizing voter suppression in too many places. And I think that's the thing that I'm concerned about. And the 2018 election started to alleviate that, but only alleviated it in certain places.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack there. I mean, certainly, I completely agree that for the first time in a long time, maybe ever, I don't know, there's a lot more attention on the importance of state-led elections, secretaries of state, other state level elections. And there are groups like Sister District, Swing Left, et cetera, that are focused on energizing voters and energizing the public. That is pretty different from having a policy transfer strategy or infrastructure like ALEC, right? I mean, it's all well and good for us in the public to care about these things, but and in fact, I would see, it seems to me that a lot of the initiative, the pro-democracy policies that have passed have many of them have been through public ballot initiative, which is also a failure of strategic policy transfer in a pro-democracy agenda. And certainly that's not universally true. Lots of state legislatures have passed AVR and others, but there is sort of this going around, needing to go. There seems to be potentially a trend of having to go around the sort of policy transfer process directly to the public for some of these pro-democracy issues, which I think is potentially problematic, or at least indicates a lack of coherent strategy in a certain sense. But certainly these ballot initiatives are really exciting, and you're right, they're happening in places that you wouldn't expect. In terms of partisan Utah. And so that's really exciting. And so just, it's a good transition to spend a few minutes talking about where we can go from here. I mean, we've talked about some state-based strategies. I mean, here at Sister District, we're going to be supporting Democrats running in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Virginia in 2019 because they hold their state-led elections in the off years, which is a voter suppression tactic that was passed by conservative state legislatures in those states. I think that this is certainly curious for your thoughts, but it seems that Democrats should not be writing off the South after Mike Espy closing the gap so much in his race, and of course Andrew Gillum and Stacey Abrams and all the rest. But there are these. It seems that one strategy to pursue a pro-democracy agenda is through the states, through flipping state legislatures, really going hard on secretaries of state and ballot initiatives where that's possible. It seems like there are others. I'm curious for your thoughts about what the courts can provide. I mean, certainly now the Reagan judicial infrastructure is in full bloom, and what is there anything left in terms of litigation strategy after the demise of Section 5? Is Section 2 still something that folks should be thinking about and pursuing?
Well, there was about 5 different points that you mentioned. Try to go through them one by one. I mean, I think that basically you do what you can where you can. So the strategy is going to be different. And I think the difference now is that the Democratic Party recognizes the importance of these issues where they have power. So in a lot of places, there were Democratic majorities and they weren't doing anything on voting rights. And you saw in the last election in 2017, when Democrats took power in Washington and in New Jersey for the first time, they immediately passed automatic voter registration and things like that. So I think the first thing is that where Democrats have power, they need to do stuff to make it easy for people to vote. I think that's actually been a fairly big shift in the party that people don't realize. Then in the places where the legislative transfer isn't possible, the reason why they did ballot initiatives in those 7 states is because they couldn't pass things, the legislative process, because Republicans wouldn't do it. Republicans in Florida weren't going to end felon disenfranchisement. Republicans in Utah weren't going to go along with nonpartisan redistricting. Republicans in other states, in Michigan, were blocking automatic voter registration. So ballot initiatives was really important. I also like ballot initiatives because it creates a constituency behind it creates momentum behind voting rights. You have to build political power to get these things passed. And I think that creates momentum for future fights, for the legislative fights that follow. So I think ballot initiatives are a really good organizing tool to get a lot of people involved. And it's something that individuals themselves can tangibly do. Because people always ask me, what can I do? And, it's hard to support litigation, but it's a lot easier to go out and mobilize to try to get people to pass something. And so I like that strategy where you can do it. The courts are tough. I mean, I think one of the things that people have looked at is state courts. It was state courts in Pennsylvania that struck down the gerrymandered maps there. That was a far quicker and more effective strategy than going through the federal courts, which are very slow, which are increasingly conservative. I think in places where you have progressive majorities on state courts, you're going to see more stuff happen through that route. I think that the House is going to have a role to play in creating national attention to some of this stuff and reminding people that the Congress does have a role. I mean, historically, when the courts did something bad on voting rights, the Congress stepped in and did something about it. And that's really been what's been missing in action. And even though what's going to happen in the House largely won't pass the Senate, the House said their first priority is going to be restoring the Voting Rights Act, doing automatic voter registration, restoring voting rights to ex-offenders, doing early voting, holding hearings investigating voter suppression. I mean, even if stuff doesn't become law, that creates momentum and attention to voting rights and makes it a top tier issue. So I think that that is important. It begins to lay the groundwork for what's going to happen in 2020. And then, I mean, I think, in places there were 3 states where Secretary of States flipped, in Michigan, in Arizona, and Colorado. That allows you to do things on an administrative level. You don't have to pass legislation. You can just have better enforcement and fair enforcement of the voting rules. You can try to do things like automatic registration on an administrative level. You can make sure that counties have enough voting machines, enough polling places. One of the things that we saw in states like Georgia was outright suppression, but also just underinvestment in our electoral system. And this really happened all across the country. I mean, I was monitoring election protection efforts on election day. And one of the things I heard all the time is people were running out of ballots. Voting machines were breaking. There weren't enough poll workers. I mean, may not be intentional, but it's indicative of a larger disinvestment in our elections. And I think that's something to keep in mind as well, that we have to counteract the suppression, but we also just have to make sure that the disparities in our society writ large are not magnified in our voting system, because that's what's happening too often. So I think it really has to be an all of the above strategy. Certain people are going to do different things. I mean, the litigators are going to file suits because that's what they do, right? But what's been missing has been boots on the ground. And I think that we found the boots on the ground. We found the boots on the ground through Sister District and Indivisible and all of the ACLU chapters and all the different people that were doing this work. And I think that the important thing is that this can't end in 2018. We're already seeing lame duck legislatures try to circumvent the voters. We're already seeing Michigan just said they might strip power from the Secretary of State. Wisconsin just said they might strip power from the new Democratic governor. North Carolina is passing voter ID. So people have got to stay mobilized. That there has to be the same now inside the legislative strategy as there was on the outside, or else these same legislatures, if they didn't shift, they're just going to try to ignore the will of the people like they've been doing for the last 8 years.
Totally. And I mean, looking forward to 2020 and keeping the momentum going and all the rest, it seems to me that 2021 will be the first set of maps drawn in a post-Shelby era. I'm curious if that matters, if you think that that'll matter, and whether that might be a rallying cry because of the importance of the next DOJ administration and all the rest to rally folks to care about state legislative elections and secretaries of state elections and governors races in states where governors have veto over maps. Does the next round of redistricting intersect here with voting rights in this way and the VRA?
Well, absolutely, because I mean, Georgia, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, they know they don't have the federal government looking over their shoulder anymore. And by the way, it was the Obama administration the last time they did this. So the states knew that they had to be especially careful. So, I mean, absolutely, they're going to feel emboldened to try to do all sorts of different trickery. And even if in states that aren't covered by Shelby, the redistricting process is going to be a huge battle. There's also going to be a huge battle over the census. The census forms the basis for redistricting. There are now 7 lawsuits challenging the census. There's a citizenship question on the census that's being litigated against that could massively depress immigrant participation, so that in California and New York and in Texas, there won't be a fair census. So you won't have fair districts as a result. So, I mean, that's really, really important too, to try to make the census as fair as possible and to try to get people to respond to it, no matter what the Trump administration does, so that there will be fair districts that follow it and a level of representation and equity in our society. But I mean, I think 2018 was the warm-up act for 2020, because the 2020 elections are going to decide who's in charge for redistricting. And that's going to be huge. And it's going to get so much more attention than it did in 2010. Republicans were focused on it in 2010. Democrats were completely asleep at the wheel here. Now I think both parties are going to really understand how important this is. You've seen more resources go into this. You've seen high-profile people like Eric Holder make redistricting their #1 issue because they understand how important that is. You've seen people rally around this. I mean, gerrymandering used to be the most obscure, wonky topic that no one cared about. Now, I mean, it's at least risen up in terms of things that motivate people. So I think it's going to be really important. I mean, I think to me, if a Republican gerrymander is just replaced by a Democratic gerrymander, I don't think that's good for democracy. And so I don't like what's going on in Maryland and other states where Democrats gerrymandered like crazy either. And so I would hope, and Eric Holder has said this, that he wants independent redistricting commissions too. And I would hope that that this is something that, when it's done, people realize that we just shouldn't have politicians drawing their own districts, because I don't think that's good for democracy writ large. And so that's going to be a whole nother fight to try to make the system more fair. But I think it's going to be critically important that, in the midst of a presidential election, people don't forget about the states. Because I think not having Trump on the ballot was in some ways the best thing that could happen in 2018, because it allowed you to focus on all of these different races. But in 2020, it's going to be a reality show all over again. It's going to be Trump versus the next contestant. And people are going to have to stay very, very motivated to make sure that the Secretary of State races, state legislative races, governors races, that state attorney general races, that they get enough attention, they have the resources they need. People start thinking about this like not weeks before the election, but like a year before, 2 years before the election. Because like people always ask me, like, what can I do about voting rights like a week before the election? I'm like, you need to be doing this.
Build a time machine.
You need to do this a year before the election, because it's very hard to change things like out of nowhere. And so Republicans have a long-term strategy for what they wanted to do. They wanted to take control of the states. They wanted to pass voter suppression laws. They wanted to change the dynamics of the census to benefit them. And there has to be a similarly long-term and well-thought-out strategy on the other side to try to counteract this. And even to think ahead of, even if we win, what's the next thing the other side is going to do to try to circumvent our win?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the sort of infrastructure and strategy. Karl Rove is a personal hero of mine in a certain way, and Jankowski and the Red Map folks. But honestly, I agree with all of that. I think that makes perfect sense. And keeping an eye on the states, I think, is incredibly important, and it's gaining traction, gaining interest, and notice by the public, and that's part of the purpose of our organization. And so it's really great to think about and highlight the ways that focusing on the states and focusing on state-led elections and other state elections has a direct impact on voting rights in those states. So we've managed to, I think, get to where we wanted to get in this conversation a little early, which is great. But I'm so grateful for you sit down with me and chat about all this stuff. I really enjoyed the book so much, and I learned so much, and I'm really hopeful that that this conversation has been useful for folks watching and for you as well, Ari.
Thanks so much, Gabby. I really appreciate the support, and keep up the good work.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.